God and Science by John W. Dawley. Copyrighted by the John W. Dawley Trust. Narrated by Michael Drew. Chapter 11. The Birth of Moses and His Preparation for His Mission. Moses' Achievement. Some of the most important symbolism of the Old Testament is to be found in the story of Moses. Hitherto we've been considering the illustration of great spiritual and metaphysical facts through myths or origin stories, sagas and folklore. The Abraham saga is believed to be based on some degree of actual history. But in the record of Moses we are dealing with something even more definite from the historical point of view. Something which, if not actually historical, can at least be described as traditional. Moreover, we come to a great character and to a series of incidents connected with that character which have influenced the whole of human history in the most remarkable manner. Whilst it is true that little that could be termed historically accurate is known about Moses and his period, yet the spiritual foundation laid at this time formed a basis from which the prophetic writers could foresee and foretell the approaching era of the Christ idea, later to be fulfilled by that greatest of all Christians and metaphysicians, Jesus of Nazareth. To appreciate the deep significance of the Mosaic era, one has only to remember that our sense of law and government today still rests largely on the basis of the commandments attributed to Moses. At the same time, it would be a mistake not to realize that a great deal that has been assigned to Moses is purely traditional, and also that the records of that period were edited and re-edited many centuries later by the prophetic writers, who introduced into them the advanced spiritual vision of their own age. For nearly 1,000 years after Moses, the Israelites attributed to him much of the teaching which they wished to have accepted. As a matter of fact, it's only within the last 50 years or so that the traditional theory that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch has been fully disproved. It is a difficult matter to assess justly the character and work of Moses. As we examine the record of his mission, every individual reader will have to form its own estimate of this colossus of human history. He was undoubtedly a great man of vision and moral courage, extremely capable, and inspired by an absolute faith in Yahweh, the Israelitish god of war. Yet, on the other hand, one cannot fail to see that he left the Hebrews with a religious and moral code from which they could not, in later years, rise to accept the Christ idea. Their own prophets told of the Christ idea as the epitome of the grace of God and of his essential nature as divine love. But creed, ritual, and dogma blinded the Israelites from accepting this comforter. Jesus analyzed this limited state of thought when he made that statement which, on the face of it, seems so extraordinary. "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers." The truth is that until the unsurpassed teaching and demonstration of Jesus, none of the world's greatest idealists had been able to grasp and formulate fully the metaphysical fact that that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. They were dealing with two factors, believing the mixture of spirit and matter as reality. Thus, they were to some extent dualists in thought, and consequently were unable to enter the promised land of infinite spirit. Jesus of Nazareth was a pure monotheist, who acknowledged and worshipped spirit alone. This is the crux of all progressive thought. The physical scientist and the religionist of the future will each have to find his promised land in the spiritual science of divine mind and mind's infinite ideas. One thing is certain. Moses rallied the Hebrews, who were in slavery in Egypt, and formed them into a nation whose contribution to humanity's moral standard has been unparalleled. Undoubtedly he accomplished this by leading them out of paganism, superstition, and gross materiality into a higher and holier sense of the one and only God. The author proposes to elaborate the proposition that Moses achieved this through an exact, ordered, and spiritual process of thought and idealism. It is evident, for example, that the commandments, on which our moral code is largely based, constitute a scientific and precise statement of God and man's duty toward him, and also of man's relationship to God and to his fellow man. Even if this is true, that Moses derived his teaching in the commandments to some extent from the Chaldeans, it may be seen from an examination of the Hammurabi tablet, now in the Louvre in Paris. This in no way detracts from the deep significance and authenticity of these teachings, but only serves to prove that the constant revelation of God's nature is one ordered development forever going on, and translating itself to every age. This revelation was later made manifest in the perfect teaching and demonstration of Jesus Christ, and is reappearing today in the form promised by Jesus as the Spirit of Truth, or scientific Christianity. In connection with the one-ordered development of truth to men, it is illuminating to realize that Joseph's achievement, which certainly was a fruitful bough and ran over the wall, formed a stepping stone in Egypt, the symbol of paganism and idolatry, for Moses' establishment of the moral law, which has ever since enabled men to come out of the many bondages of Egypt, or that which is called in the New Testament the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Later it will be shown that Moses' commandments embody to a great extent the spirit of the seed plot of Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2:3, and that they present not only the Word of God, but also the Christ. In fact, there's no doubt that it was at this point in Bible history that the emphasis on the ordered statement of the Word of God began to yield to the realization of the ever-present Christ idea in its infinite identity with God. Consequently, Moses is always spoken of as a prototype of the Christ, though the prototype was not Moses himself, but his teaching, as epitomized in the commandments. Later, Jesus illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount the ordered revelation not only of the Word and of the Christ, but also of Christianity and of science, for that great sermon presents all four aspects of the divine calculus. The Bible tells one story. Thus, as we go forward in the close study of the Bible, we are forced to the conclusion that we are watching the inspired, exact, ordered, and scientific development of the divine idea, revealing God to men through infinite symbols and in manifold detail. The Bible story is a chain whose every link is accurately forged to fit the next, so that it holds together as one harmonious whole. It is one infinite story of one God, expressing himself as one Word, one Christ, one Christianity, and one divine science of reality, forever translating itself to men through cultured spiritual understanding, and always in absolute accord with the design of the Bible given in the first chapter of Genesis. In the consideration of these stories in the Old Testament as illustrations of the divine idea, it must always be borne in mind that they were put into their final form by prophets who wrote between 550 BC and 300 BC. They were the school of writers who, when in exile in Babylon, originated the scientific record of the 7 days of the creation or revelation, and specifically placed this seed plot at the beginning of their writings. By so doing, they established for all time definite numerals of spiritual thought and a divine calculus of inspired metaphysical computation, whereby all men, throughout eternity, could understand and compute the realities of being and of divinity. We must never forget that having established this perfect system of divine metaphysics, they proceeded to use manifold details of national myths, sagas, traditions, and personal experiences to illustrate the science and ethics of that system, insofar as the conservatism of the period would permit. Thus we find throughout the Scriptures, from Genesis to Revelation, constant elucidation of the way of true salvation through the outstanding symbols of the One, signifying the Divine One, God Himself. The Three, signifying the essential nature of God as life or fatherhood, truth or sonship, and love or motherhood. The Four, signifying the divine infinite calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity and science. The Seven, of perfection, signifying the infinite numerals of spiritual thought and idea. The 10, signifying the application to the human problem of the perfect spiritual ideas, revealed by the 7 days of creation. This application taking place through the threefold process of analysis, exposure, and annihilation. And lastly, the 12, signifying the showing forth or demonstration in any degree of God's essential threefold nature, through the use and understanding of the fourfold infinite calculus of divine ideas. The author is aware of the fact that in reiterating these fundamentals he may be taxing the patience of the quick and trained thinker. But his excuse is that in actual contact with others he has found that the ordinary man appreciates this repetition, and he therefore asks the more experienced thinker to bear with him in this matter. Hebrews in bondage in Egypt. Undoubtedly in the time of Moses, the Hebrew people became a nation, one whose thinkers have done much for mankind. The teachings of this period, therefore, demand careful and exhaustive analysis from a most exalted standpoint. If it is true that the prophetic writers, although attempting to establish some conception of traditional history for their race, yet realized that this was only important insofar as it was associated with the constant development of the spiritual idea, then surely we shall not go far astray if we consider their writings in this light, rather than as a historical record. The narrative of Moses bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt and leading them through the wilderness is interesting enough as history, but the incident is of little avail today if it is viewed as a mere physical happening. The substance and the wealth of the story lies in the fact that today every one of us has experienced or is experiencing to some extent the Egypt of doubt, fear, bondage and sorrow, and the understanding of the exact spiritual symbolism used in this record will show us the scientific way out of Egypt. In the intermediary stages of the journey from a material sense of things to a spiritual sense, we may have to go through a wilderness, where we are mentally sorting things out and leaving outworn notions behind. But if we have a high goal always before us, we shall reach the promised land after 40 years. That is, after understanding something of the foretold divine calculus as applied to our daily experience. The time necessary for this accomplishment is long or short, according to our desire and our earnestness. The first chapter of Exodus records the conditions under which the Hebrews were living after many years' sojourn in Egypt. How many years no one knows, and the length of the period seems to be a matter of guesswork. The biblical record would make it appear that at this time there were about 2 million Hebrews in Egypt, but it is now generally recognized that this was an exaggeration, and there were probably not more than 10,000 of them. It's an interesting fact that the two periods in which the history of the Hebrew people is least documented were just before the birth of Moses and just before the birth of Jesus. It is as though there was a significant hush before these two great events. Exodus 1:8 reads, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." The Pharaoh of Joseph's day had understood and appreciated Joseph's spiritual vision of the one God. Evidently, this vision, as symbolized by Joseph, was no longer appreciated either by the Egyptians or by the Hebrews in bondage in Egypt. Paganism and superstition reigned supreme. Many authorities on the Bible believe at this time Yahweh was little more than a name to the Hebrews, and hardly entered into their religious calculations at all. Subsequent happenings would seem to indicate the truth of this assertion, and also that many of the Hebrews were at that period absorbed in the worship of Egyptian gods. Consequently, all that Joseph symbolized of the divine nature was for the time being dormant in them. The Hebrews had become bondservants to the Egyptians, and the prophetic writers used this condition to symbolize the bondage to sin and sorrow and materialism, which enslaves each one of us when we forget or forsake our spiritual vision. The birth of Moses. Evidently the Pharaoh of that period, whose name is still only a surmise, had decided on the destruction of the male children of the Hebrews, even as Herod was to do later. Pharaohs and Herods always suspect the coming of a new sense of the divine idea, in the same way that uncultured thought feels and resents a more cultured sense. It is recorded that Pharaoh commanded the Hebrew midwives, of whom only 2 are mentioned, to destroy every male Hebrew child. But the midwives no more responded to this request than the wise men later responded to Herod's request to help him locate the babe Jesus. Eventually, Pharaoh is supposed to have demanded that the Egyptian should make certain of the death of every male child of the Hebrews by casting it into the river when it was born. The 2 stories in the Bible of the attempt to slay male children are both used to symbolize that the carnal mind ever seeks to destroy the Christ idea, whenever and wherever it appears. What a dramatic setting the prophetic writers have furnished for us at this point. Joseph and his vision gone, the Hebrews in bondage to Pharaoh and in ignorance of Yahweh, the time ripe for deliverance, Pharaoh suspecting this and laying his plans to keep them in bondage, the 2 midwives feeling the divine impulse and refusing to be Pharaoh's tools, all the Egyptians called upon to help in the destruction of the Hebrews' children. It certainly was an illustration of the darkest hour preceding the dawn. What a setting, and who but the prophetic writers could have done full justice to it, and all in a few short sentences. The great drama begins in earnest with this scene. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived, and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child, and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. Exodus 2:1 through Genesis 10. The story of a child placed in an ark and put on the water, to be found by a royal personage and taken into the royal family, is a well-known Eastern fable, and the writers of the Elohistic document used this fable to illustrate the infinite safety of true identity in this 3,000 years of the Bible record. Universal spiritual education in the divine facts. Suppose that today we understood the definiteness and certainty of God's nature as soul, and could therefore prove the ever-availability of safety and sanctity in the midst of bitter persecution and chaos. What would not this spiritual understanding do for our age, when humanity's progress seems to be threatened on every side by evil forces of disruption and bondage? The author knows that an understanding of God's nature as soul can be used individually to free men and to protect all that is worth protecting, because in some small measure he has proved this for over 40 years, both for himself and others, and there are many who can bear testimony to this. Think what the result would be, moreover, if humanity in general was spiritually and scientifically educated in the understanding and use of the infinite range of ideas which reveal God as mind, the divine intelligence as spirit, the only substance as soul, the infinite identity as the divine one, the all and only as life, the eternal as truth, the infinite consciousness, and as love, the divine perfection. And if humanity were educated in the understanding and use of the four-ordered ways in which these synonymous terms for God forever combine and reflect each other, then men would really study the Scriptures, because they would be able to see the inspired illustration throughout of a perfect divine system of metaphysics, operative under all circumstances. All that is of importance in the Bible would then stand out significantly as related to eternity and reality, and the divine tones would become so natural and dynamic in thought that they would transform the desire to know God into the living presence and power of the Christ idea, forever healing, saving, and redeeming men from every phase of evil, of Egypt. This will surely happen at some time, for Jesus was stating a scientific fact when he said, "He that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father." Because divine principle, God, can always be demonstrated when understood. The divine identity reveals the true relationship of manhood and womanhood. The story of Moses proceeds to tell how as a young man he slew an Egyptian who was maltreating an Israelite, and in consequence Moses had to flee from Egypt. Of course, it's very doubtful whether he was ever in Egypt at this time. Historically, there is no proof of his sojourn there. Tradition holds that his youth was spent there, and evidently the prophetic writers who edited the record considered it useful to embody it in the story. It stated that Moses fled from Egypt and dwelt in the land of Midian. Immediately on his arrival in Midian, he was met at the well by the 7 daughters of Reuel, the priest of Midian, and he protected them from the shepherds who were hindering them, and then helped the daughters of Reuel to water their flocks. Here let us pause for a moment to consider a very interesting and important aspect of this story. It'll be remembered that Joseph displayed in a great measure the qualities of true womanhood and motherhood, and that Jacob's blessing on Joseph included blessings of the breasts and of the womb. After the record of Joseph's love, compassion, understanding, and protection, all aspects of true womanhood, the first chapter of Exodus, develops this sense of womanhood by illustrating how it helped to preserve the appearing of the right idea of God and of man, as true womanhood always does. First, there is the symbol of the 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who refused to help Pharaoh destroy the male children of the Hebrews. Next, there is the emphasis on Moses' mother and her determination to save him by means of an ark, spiritual understanding. Thirdly, there is the story of Pharaoh's daughter and her maidens, and Moses' sister, who were instrumental in bringing about his safety. Finally, Moses was met and welcomed by the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian. Knowing that the Hebrews constantly used 7 as a symbol of perfection, and taking into account the inaccuracy of historical data, can any thinker really believe that there were literally 7 daughters? Was it not being indicated through this symbol how some understanding of the perfect spiritual idea of womanhood comforted and inspired Moses, and welcomed the divine idea in his thinking? The Hebrew prophets were masters of symbolism, and they frequently used the symbol 7 in such a way. Isaiah, for instance, writing in the prophetic age of Israel, uses it thus: "And in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own bread, and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name, to take away our reproach." Is it possible to believe that Isaiah literally meant 7 women, rather than the mental and spiritual quality of womanhood in all its completeness and perfection? If in our generation we begin to conceive of the motherhood of God as being equally essential as the fatherhood to define the divine nature, then we shall grasp the deep significance of the prophetic symbols of 7 daughters and 7 women. Whilst it is true that the story of Moses emphasizes the fatherhood and masculinity of God as a God of war, it's also evident that his mission was largely made possible through a very active and inspired sense of womanhood. Moreover, Moses' 10 commandments were designed to establish a true sense of relationship, the relationship of man to God, and of men to each other. One of the most important aspects of relationship which calls for right adjustment is the relationship between man and woman. The third day of creation, and its illustration in the 3,000 years of Bible history, contains in its revelation of true identity many of the answers to the problems of sex. This is particularly true of the story of Moses. Let us remember that Moses has often been considered as a prototype of the Christ, and that when Jesus fully revealed the Christ idea, he gave the sense of God as love. And this aspect of God's nature was emphasized by the beloved disciple John. God as love expresses the motherhood and womanhood of the divine nature, and the impulsion of this highest aspect of the infinite inevitability causes men to give up the outworn conception of a merely male God and a God of war and vengeance, and to regard God as both father and mother. Consequently, it's being perceived today that the essence of manhood lies in the combination of the vitally important qualities of womanhood and motherhood with the masculine qualities. Hence, the continual development of sex equality in human experience. If we really understood the divine plan intelligently, we should recognize that man is not a material organism, but the image, the idea of God. Therefore, we should see that race distinctions, class distinctions, and sex distinctions are temporal and of mortal thought, not of God. God's true nature is Father, Son, and Mother, and so is the individual man, whether humanly called male or female, reflects this threefold nature, because he is God's likeness. True manhood and true womanhood consist of essentially spiritual qualities constituting the birthright of every individual. Material sense argues that there are 2 or perhaps 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. It also limits man to 5 senses. But the scientific fact remains that since divine mind, the only cause, is infinite, all that constitutes its idea, man, must express infinite gender and have infinite senses. The word gender originally meant kind or sort, and every idea of mind has its own gender, its own kind or sort. If the infinite cause had created any 2 ideas with the same gender, then the infinite would have duplicated and would not have been infinite in classification and diversification, because every idea is different, but at the same time reflects every other idea in the divine plan. The scientific fact must be that every one of God's ideas is forever wedded to every other idea in the highest and holiest wedlock. Every idea is in conscious identity with the divine mind, and in absolute unity with its infinite ideas. How small and meagre will seem our human expressions of relationship constantly breaking down in aggressive war, murder, class hatred, divorce, and so on, when we attain some measure of the mind of Christ and understand the true nature and relationship of God, man, and the universe. As men understand the one divine entity, or the nature of God as infinite soul, which identifies every idea with itself, the inseparability of all interests will become more and more apparent. Then war must cease, the true brotherhood of man be realized, and a measure of peace and spiritual progress beyond present human conception come to our age. Does the reader begin to see what the definite understanding of the scientific facts regarding soul will do for mankind? It will enable every individual to say, in some degree, I and my Father are one. Looking back at the scriptural record, one cannot fail to see the constant influence of womanhood. In the first chapter of Genesis, it is declared that God made man both male and female, and it must be remembered that the whole record of creation is in an ascending order. Later, it is recorded that it was the woman, Eve, who had spiritual sense enough to track sin back to its original source, and thereby make it impersonal. She said, "The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat." It takes the qualities of true discernment and watchfulness, qualities of womanhood, to realize that sin is always the outcome of one evil, the liar and its lie. As long as men regard sin and materiality as actual realities and pertaining to persons, they will not be able to comprehend Jesus' analytical statement regarding evil when he said, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do." He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it. Eve's perception that all evil is the outcome of the one evil, and never of true manhood, indicates the first faint motion of the coming of the Christ idea. The prophets symbolized great contributions to spiritual attainment in human experience by such figures as Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and in a slightly different way by the midwives in Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter and her maidens, and the 7 daughters of Reuel. And moreover, they depicted a definite sense of womanhood as operative in Joseph. Tracing this development of the true idea of womanhood through the first 3,000 years of Bible history, who can doubt that in the process of time it will be realized that the infinite and perfect cause, called God, who is in himself Father, Son, and Mother, could only create man in his likeness to exhibit in a degree each of these divine characteristics. This man cannot be a material organism nor a sexual being, but is always of the nature of idea, and therefore divinely mental and spiritual. Perhaps nothing enslaves an individual more than an abnormal sex outlook and an unwillingness to control and purify this condition. As long as we believe that the real man is a material organism born through sex, bondage and dissatisfaction will naturally continue. But the day is dawning when human hope and desire demand and must gain a truer and more intelligent sense not only of God, but also of man as God's idea and likeness, embracing true manhood and womanhood. Let it be quite clearly understood that the author is under no delusions as to the difficulties of this question, nor is he unaware of the importance and value at the present time of the very lovely relationship which can exist between a good man and a true woman, a relationship which constitutes that all-important factor in human experience which we call home. But every decent man and woman knows that in a real home sex eventually counts for less and less, and spiritual values for more and more. Scientific fact in spiritual matters, however, is unalterable, ordered, fixed, definite, and demonstrable. It cannot be changed to suit human conditions, because soul is permanent and changeless. soul sense will always better human conditions and bring discordant relationships back to harmony. The spiritual understanding of the one infinite identity of a man as an idea of soul, forever in harmony with and reflecting every other idea, though never absorbed by any other idea, must inevitably purify and strengthen the human institution of marriage. This purification must go on until men and women arrive at that spiritual scientific altitude of thought which Jesus foretold when he said, "In the resurrection they neither marry, nor are they given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." Heaven is conscious spiritual unity with God, available here and now. Hell is the fruit of accepting the material, finite, false sense of God, man, and the universe. Heaven in music might be said to be the conscious understanding of the subject, and the harmony resulting from that understanding. Hell in music is ignorance of the subject, and the resulting discord. Heaven, therefore, is the mind of Christ, and hell is the carnal mind. Heaven is divinely mental and spiritual. Hell is mortally mental and material. Unless we begin to gain heaven here and now, and unless we begin to put off hell here and now, we shall never get very far. It would have been impossible to consider intelligently Moses' real mission in the 3,000 years of the Bible record without a brief survey of this subject. It was the ordered defining of God's nature as the one infinite identity, or soul, which enabled Moses to set up in the commandments what we know as a moral standard, demanding the true relationship of men to God and to each other. The Israelites had been absorbed in fertility cults, and, as the prophets describe it, they had gone a-whoring after other gods, animal worship, Baal worship, and so forth. Moses was the leader who established somewhat of the true standard. Today our standard must necessarily be higher. The manna of yesterday will not do for today. This is the scientific age, and so our standard needs to be scientific as well as moral and spiritual. If any reader of this book is cursed with an exaggerated sex complex and desires to get rid of it, let him begin to understand the third day of creation and all that it means. Let him begin to grasp the spiritual sense of the symbols used in the 3,000 years of the Bible record. And as his thought begins to be permeated with the true nature of God as infinite soul, he will find a sense of divine satisfaction and completeness that will inevitably extirpate that pernicious condition. This is no idle promise. Spiritual ideas are substantial entities, and when entertained, they operate with power. Moses at the burning bush. Chapter 3 of Exodus gives an account of that remarkable experience of Moses when for the first time he's supposed to have identified the nature of God as Yahweh, or as I am that I am. It begins by recording that Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. Sheep are always used in the Bible as a symbol of consecrated thought. Moses was tending his thoughts, pondering and understanding the ideas of God which he'd gained from his association with Jethro. Some authorities believe that Moses had his first glimpse of Yahweh from Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. It has never been definitely decided where Horeb is, and its actual location is of little importance. But this first verse of chapter 3 is alive with spiritual symbolism, when we see that Moses was constantly engaged in the earnest contemplation of the things of God, and at length reached the desert of human hopes, where he saw that materiality was barren, and then arrived at the stage of exalted spiritual vision, symbolized by Mount Horeb, where he saw the wonderful sight of the burning bush, which was not consumed. Here Moses must have gained some idea of the great metaphysical fact that the fires of sin, disease, and death, although they may seem to be very real to human sense, can never touch true spiritual identity, symbolized by the bush. The herb, or bush, was a well-known symbol to the Hebrew writers, and it first appeared in the account of the third day of creation, when the earth brought forth grass, the word of God, the herb, the Christ idea, and the fruit tree, Christianity. At this point in the record there is introduced one of the most enlightening statements of the Bible, a statement which, if understood, accepted, and put into practice today, would do much to change for the better the whole of human experience. And Moses said, I will now turn aside, and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Exodus 3:3. In modern terminology, we should probably say that it set him thinking, and surely our age is one that demands thinkers. We would do well to comprehend the full import of this verse, and to act upon it. The question is, will the thinker of today tend constantly and devotedly to his flock, his spiritual thoughts and ideas? Will he then come to the backside of the desert, discern the barren nature of materiality, and straightway be willing to turn aside and see why eternal things of the Spirit can never be destroyed by the consuming fires of materiality? Will he pause to consider why there are many men and women in the world who, in spite of the depressing picture of materiality, still believe in God and understand something of spiritual reality, and why there is still the upsurging desire to find the nature of the great first cause? This forever springing up of earnest, intelligent, spiritual desire can never be quenched, and some day men are going to turn aside like Moses to find the reason. If our thinkers will do this today, and will accept only spiritual and truly scientific conclusions, then that which happened to Moses individually will happen again today, and on a higher scale. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Exodus 3:4. And when one compares Moses' direct answer to God, Here am I, with the shifty and fear-filled excuses of Adam and Eve, who, when called by God, hid themselves among the trees of the garden, the physical senses, one realizes that spiritual thought has travelled a long way in the line of light and revelation. One always hides from an avenging God and a doomed man, but one can ever fearlessly seek the light which reveals an infinitely good God and man in his image and likeness. If we look back, we can see how the ability to analyze the Adam myth swelled into the understanding of the Noah experience, and then how the definiteness and identity of God's nature expanded in thought until it culminated in the definition of God given to Moses at the burning bush. The same sense of the ever-developing Christ idea, the one ideal of the one and only divine cause, is conveyed in the revelation which came to Moses at this juncture, namely, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Exodus 3:6. The vision of the burning bush evidently enabled Moses to see that there was still spiritual sense among the Hebrews in Egypt, and that spirituality could never be consumed, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. Thus he saw that it was his duty to go down into Egypt and bring his people out of the mesmerism of paganism and the results of paganism, bondage and misery of every kind. Demanding to know the name and nature of God, Moses was answered in these words, And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Of course, the infinite is forever revealing itself in its own infinitude, and Moses was here enabled to understand somewhat of this infinitude. Spiritual revelation is usually introduced in the Scriptures by the words, and God said, thereby tracing every effect back to its original divine cause. If Moses or any one of us perceives something that is spiritually and intrinsically true, the impulsion behind that vision must always be the one divine mind, God. Moses now realized that if he wanted his fellow Hebrews to accept his vision of the I am that I am, he would have to convince them that this was no new God, but a higher sense of the one and only God. Today this is imperative also. We cannot ask our fellow men to discard their former religious beliefs, which have helped them and comforted them, but we can and should try to convince them that the nature of the infinite will forever develop in thought, and that in the approach to truth there must be infinite progress. Jesus hinted at this in such statements as, "I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another Comforter," and "He that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do." There can never be finality in the approach to truth. We must ever strive to understand more of the fundamental nature of truth itself. Moses realized the grandeur, yet the burden, of the vision of God as Yahweh, and he was filled with fear and doubt. Fear as to whether he could induce the people to listen to him, and doubt as to his own ability. How often, when we see the vastness of truth and realize the magnitude of even our own small part in establishing it, we tremble at the responsibility it would seem to involve. But we should see, like Moses, that our understanding of God is dynamic and demands proof. Oh, that we would always demand signs from our understanding of God, that we would demand that our idealism be essentially practical and demonstrable, and not mere blind optimism. The 3 signs given to Moses. Moses was then given 3 signs. In other words, he began to perceive distinctly the power which lay in the definite understanding of God. First of all, he saw that it would enable him to handle the serpent of evil as sin. This was symbolized by his casting down of his rod. He was to deny the testimony of the 5 physical senses, the rod on which we all rely and from which we suffer so much. Immediately he recognized that the testimony of the physical senses was the serpent of evil, and when he dealt with it fearlessly, it again became a rod in his hand. But this time a rod of understanding, by which he could intelligently analyze or measure all thought. Secondly, through spiritual sense, he saw that he could expose the temporal and therefore unreal nature of disease, even of leprosy. The sign or symbol given here was that after he had put his hand into his bosom, his consciousness, and drawn it forth, leprous as snow, and had then repeated the process, his hand was restored whole as the other. To this second sign, the healing of disease, Jesus attached great importance, for he constantly used it to convince his fellow men. Thirdly, Moses saw that he could take the life-giving waters of truth and pour them on the thirsty and parched thought of mankind, till the parched thought revived. This was symbolized by the command to take the water of the river and pour it on the dry land, where it would become blood, a sign of life. The only death a good man should fear is that of being dead to spiritual things. This third sign, therefore, embraces the overcoming of all that might be termed death. These 3 signs symbolized Moses' realization of the power of spiritual vision to destroy the 3-in-1 of evil, sin, disease, and death. Even after these signs, Moses still distrusted his own ability. He was under no delusions as to the immensity of the task before him, and he is supposed to have declared to God that he was slow of speech, whereupon he was reminded that Aaron, his brother, could speak for him. This unwillingness on Moses' part to rely entirely on the divine and his consequent acceptance of Aaron must have later cost him many a pang, as Aaron was eventually to become more of a liability than an asset. We all make mistakes of demanding personal support rather than divine protection and guidance, and inevitably we pay the price of this mistake. Moses, armed with his rod, was now ready to undertake his mission. The spiritual idea must ever develop. Can the reader see how the definite sense of God's nature as the one divine identity and man's particular and inseparable relation to that nature is growing and developing in the 3,000 years of Bible history? This development was illustrated, for instance, by the record of the individual Abraham, expanding into the record of the family, Jacob and his 12 sons, the record of the family into that of the tribe. The 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel, and that of the tribe into that of the nation, the attainment of the promised land. But all emphasizing the one divine identity, the nature of God as soul. See Appendix 1. Can the reader now visualize also the grandeur, the loveliness, the vastness, and the truly scientific nature of the divine tones or numerals of spiritual thought, as revealed by the prophets of Israel and embodied in the first chapter of Genesis? It may be centuries before these numerals and their tones are understood by mankind as a whole. But the individual can start now to gain for himself a practical understanding of this vast subject of God, man, and the universe. As he does this on both a spiritual and a scientific basis, he will understand and appreciate the one infinite, appearing as the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the I am that I am, the God of the prophets and of Jesus Christ, the God of Christianity, and the infinite one of our own day. Surely the trained thinker, the physical scientist, for instance, researching into atomic energy, will one day find in the study of spiritual science a vaster and more important field for research than he could ever find in his research into physical things, the basis of which has been described by Dunoui as perfect disorder. Will the lack of progressiveness in religious thought keep the alert religionist from this vital search? And will the materialism of physical science hide from the advanced physical scientist the substance and reality of spiritual things? There is no time to lose, for only the understanding of the spiritual will enable us to have permanent dominion over the vagaries of human thought and experience. The writer is convinced beyond a shadow of doubt that the hour has struck when earnest and intelligent thinkers in the realms of both religion and physical science can no longer be content with the results of dualistic or materialistic thinking. Before long, all that is best in both science and religion will unite in the attempt to understand and prove the actuality and might of a divine principle or God who is spirit, and whose universe is one of perfect spiritual ideas.